A shiver clawed through the void between stars, a whisper of thought twisting into screaming flame. Worlds that had long known order and discipline trembled beneath a single unbridled mind. The air in the command spire of Viridian Prime tasted of ozone and ash, the faint hum of the Astronomicon trembling like a heartbeat against the warped signals of a rogue Psyker, whose presence had gone unnoticed until it was far too late. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum had fallen silent on distant worlds, their vox channels spewing static and fragmented prayers. A rumor, whispered in the corridors of Sanctum Imperialis, claimed that the Psyker's mind shimmered with fragments of the warp itself, a conduit of chaos that even the Inquisition feared to trace. And yet the most terrifying question remained unanswered. If one mind could unravel countless worlds, what hope remained for the billions who could not flee, who could not fight, who could only watch as their reality was bent, torn, and consumed? If the shadow of this story ignites your curiosity, linger with me. Like, share, and subscribe to ensure you walk every step of the grimdark path. Witnessing truths the Imperium prays remain hidden. The first tremor was almost imperceptible, a flicker in the data slates of Viridian Prime's command spire, dismissed at first as a faulty sensor. Lieutenant Kalen felt it before anyone else, the subtle pulse of the warp brushing against the edge of his consciousness. The officers around him, heads bowed over orders and vox grills, noticed nothing, but Kalen's mind recoiled at the unnatural resonance. It was not fear that gripped him, not yet, but an uncanny awareness that reality itself had shifted. Somewhere, unseen and unbidden, a presence reached out with delicate fingers and pressed against the thin membrane between worlds. The Psyker's mind, unanchored, unbound, stirred, and the universe answered with a shiver that spread from sector to sector. By the time the first reports arrived from the outskirts of the city, the spire was already aflame with confusion. Vox channels crackled with fragmented signals. A regiment of guardsmen had vanished, their communications reduced to screams laced with static and fragments of incomprehensible chant. Kalen pressed his hand to his brow, trying to parse the rhythmic cadence of panic that now threaded through the command room. He had heard tales of the warp's caprice, of rogue psychers whose awakening left entire worlds hollowed by psychic storm. But this was different. It was intimate, personal, and malicious, as if a single mind had decided that the cosmos itself should bend to its chaotic whim. The air seemed thick with static and the metallic tang of ozone, as though the very circuits of the spire were straining under an invisible force. Down below, the city writhed. Civilians fled from manufactorums whose furnaces had exploded without warning, from streets now torn by sudden tremors, from shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally at the edge of perception. Children clutched parents, begging in a language half understood, while Vox Grill operators screamed into the void, trying and failing to make contact with units already lost to the psychic storm. Rumors began to coil through the citizenry. A mind unhinged from the Emperor's light, a vessel of chaos, a being that could think across worlds and turn order into ash. Even the priests in the sanctums muttered hurried litanies, their fingers trembling across rosarius and reliquary, and prayed that the Emperor's gaze could shield them from the unseen corruption that now threaded through every data slate and servo skull. Kalen descended to the street level, guided by a combination of intuition and panic, where the chaos became physical. Smoke rose from shattered manufactorums, a choking pall that carried the scent of burnt promethium and charred flesh. Soldiers stumbled over rubble, their laser guns discarded or useless, their armor cracked and sparking as if rejecting the unnatural interference in the ambient field. The Psyker's influence did not simply destroy, it distorted, reshaping perceptions. Kalen caught glimpses of fellow guardsmen where they should not have been, of corridors folding impossibly back upon themselves, of shadows whispering in a voice that sounded faintly like their own. Survival was a fragile concept now, and every heartbeat seemed to reverberate with an echo of inevitability. And yet, beneath the fear, a strange clarity took hold. Kalen realized that this was no random surge, no accident of psychic misalignment. This mind, the rogue Psyker, whoever or whatever they were, acted with intent, threading chaos through the veins of the world as if testing the limits of human endurance. Every shriek, every tremor, every flickering light in the city's spires was part of a larger design that none could yet comprehend. The lieutenant's grip on his chainsword tightened, a small human defiance against a force that seemed almost godlike in its reach. But even as he marched into the smoke, into the screams, he felt the tug at the edges of his sanity, the invisible fingers probing for weaknesses. He knew instinctively that this confrontation was not merely about survival, it was about witnessing the first echoes of a power that could unravel entire sectors of the Imperium. The city's Vox channels crackled again, and this time Kalen caught fragments of the transmission clearly. They see everything. Turning, cannot stop. The words were broken, distorted by the warp, but the meaning was undeniable. Somewhere, across the void, across planets still unaware of their peril, the rogue Psyker moved. The tremors would spread, the screams would multiply, and the lives of billions, from the highest governors to the lowest serf, were now caught in a storm whose nature was incomprehensible, yet intimately cruel. Kalen swallowed against the taste of fear in his mouth, pressed forward, and realized that nothing in his training, nothing in his loyalty to the Emperor, could prepare him for what was coming next. Kalen's steps carried him through streets that were no longer entirely his own, buildings bent and warped in ways that defied logic, their stone and steel twisting like putty under the psychic pressure radiating from the rogue mind. He caught glimpses of citizens frozen mid-step, their eyes wide and unblinking as if time itself had paused to observe their terror. The air vibrated with the low hum of disrupted machinery, of manufactorums groaning under stresses they were never meant to bear, and the metallic tang of burnt servos mixed with the acrid smoke of ignited promethium. Each breath drew in both fear and resolve, a heady mixture that sharpened Kalen's senses even as it threatened to undo him from within. He passed a Vox-hailer spitting fragmented prayers into the sky, the voice of a priest mangled by interference, calling upon the Emperor for protection. The words were familiar yet alien, syllables stretched and distorted, resonating in the minds of those who listened. Kalen could feel them like currents in a pool, ripples that tugged at memory and sanity alike. For a moment he questioned whether these distortions were real or a product of his own fraying perception, a doubt that the Psyker seemed to feed on with invisible intent. Each heartbeat became a drum, echoing against the warped cityscape, a metronome counting down to an inevitable revelation that he was powerless to forestall. As he rounded the corner of a collapsed manufactorum, Kalen glimpsed the first corporeal evidence of the psychic assault. Guardsmen, his peers, convulsing violently, as though every nerve in their bodies were being rewritten by unseen hands. Their laser guns discharged sporadically, arcs of red light cutting jagged paths through the smoke yet hitting nothing and no one. The screams were guttural, mingling with static and unrecognizable tones, voices straining through the warp as the Psyker's influence reached deeper into the city's heart. Kalen's stomach churned, but he forced himself to move closer, desperate for comprehension, for any glimmer of control. In the haze, Kalen saw a child clutching a shattered servo skull, its tiny hands trembling against the cold metal. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting flickers of fire and distorted sky, and Kalen felt a pang that cut sharper than any lasgun blast. He wanted to reach out, to comfort, to guide, but a subtle pressure brushed against his mind, a whisper that was not his own, warning that any gesture might bring death. The rogue Psyker was everywhere and nowhere, a presence without form, bending reality like a sculptor with infinite patience. Each flicker of perception threatened to break the fragile barrier between the corporeal and the psychic, and Kalen understood that no one could simply flee from this storm. Survival demanded more than courage. It demanded attunement to the very distortions themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a manufacturing furnace erupted, sending molten metal spewing like blood across the cobblestones. The heat and light illuminated grotesque shadows, statuesque in their frozen horror, revealing the city's pulse as something alive yet alien. Kalen paused, his hand instinctively brushing against the chainsword at his belt, and for a moment he could feel the rhythm of the Psyker's thought. A slow, deliberate weaving of chaos. It was a tapestry he could not yet read, threads of reality bending at angles impossible to describe. Yet the pattern was undeniable. The rogue mind was constructing a vision of destruction, a proof of its dominion over the fragile order of human civilization. Kalen's lips moved in a silent prayer, a repetition of words he scarcely believed could reach the Emperor. Yet he felt a flicker of something enduring amid the chaos. Human determination, the stubborn insistence of flesh and will against incomprehensible force. The Psyker's tendrils of thought might stretch across worlds, but here, in the fractured streets of Viridian, a single lieutenant could choose to act. He would not run. He would not collapse into despair. Each step forward was defiance, an assertion that the Emperor's light, however dimmed, had not yet been extinguished. And even as the city twisted and screamed around him, Kalen understood that this was only the beginning, the first pulse of a storm whose reach would soon eclipse the understanding of mortals. Kalen moved deeper into the city, the ground beneath him vibrating with a rhythm that was both mechanical and alive. The walls of the manufacturums and residential blocks seemed to pulse as if breathing, their shadows twisting unnaturally across the rubble-strewn streets. Servitors, usually mindless and obedient, twitched erratically, their optics flickering with corrupted data streams. Some fell silent altogether, frozen mid-task as the Psyker's psychic waves rewrote their programming in cruel mockery of the Adeptus Mechanicus's designs. Kalen could feel the subtle hum of the warp in every metal surface, a resonance that gnawed at the rational parts of his mind, urging him to question what was real and what was an illusion. As he rounded another corner, he caught sight of a squad of guardsmen pinned against a collapsed wall. Their lasguns had misfired, some barrels melted from heat that shouldn't exist, others firing erratically into the air. Their eyes darted, wild and unfocused, pupils dilated as if staring into multiple realities at once. Kalen shouted their names, but his voice seemed swallowed by a haze of static and whispered echoes, as though the Psyker was folding sound upon itself. One of the men raised a hand in a plea that was at once terrified and strangely reverent, a recognition of the terrible intelligence guiding this assault. The city, the regiment, the very laws of nature seemed to bend toward a singular unspoken will. Above, the sky shimmered with unnatural hues. The auroras of Viridian Prime twisted into impossible spirals, flames and smoke reflecting in ribbons of warped light. Kalen noticed the subtle vibrations in the air, the metallic taste of charged ions lingering on his tongue, the scent of promethium burning in rhythms he could almost hear. Time itself seemed to stutter and skip, as if the rogue Psyker were drawing threads of causality from one moment to another, unweaving the order that had been painstakingly built by millennia of Imperial discipline. Even the most hardened veterans of the Astra Militarum seemed to falter under the psychic pressure, their confidence shattered by an invisible hand that toyed with their perception. Kalen's thoughts returned to the child he had seen clutching the shattered servo skull. The boy's trembling hands and wide eyes were an emblem of everything imperiled. Innocence caught between powers beyond comprehension. A moral question burned at the edges of Kalen's consciousness. Could survival justify the sacrifices being made? The lives twisted into vessels of psychic experimentation? Every instinct screamed to shield the helpless, yet the psychic storm mocked his hesitation, pressing him forward with an inevitability that seemed both cruel and precise. He realized in that instant that the Psyker's power was not merely physical but philosophical. It demanded confrontation with the nature of choice, of morality, of human resilience in the face of cosmic indifference. As he pressed onward, Kalen became aware of a pattern in the chaos. Small details, almost imperceptible, hinted at intent behind the madness. A line of scorched cobblestones forming a distorted symbol, a section of wall that flickered with residual psychic energy, echoes of the Psyker's thoughts lingering in the minds of those nearby. The rogue mind was constructing not only destruction but a narrative, a signature woven into the very fabric of the city. Each step forward, each act of human defiance, became a verse in a tragic poem the Psyker authored across Viridian Prime. Kalen shivered, sensing that he had become both spectator and participant in a spectacle of horror that would resonate long after the fires were extinguished. A distant scream, human yet stretched into something inhuman, drew his attention toward the central spire. Smoke and twisted metal climbed into the sky, forming a jagged monument to the psychic chaos. Kalen approached cautiously, noting the subtle distortions in gravity and light, the way shadows moved contrary to the position of the sun. Every instinct screamed to flee, to call for reinforcements, to abandon the city to its fate. But the lieutenant pressed on, understanding that inaction would allow the rogue Psyker to deepen the fracture, to spread the storm beyond Viridian. Every step was a battle against fear, every breath a challenge to the invisible currents of corruption that threatened to overwhelm him. Finally, as he reached the base of the central spire, Kalen paused, placing a hand on the scorched metal railing. The whispers of the warp were loud now, layered with fragments of memory, desire, and rage. Faces of those lost flashed in his mind, their voices melding into a chorus of agony and warning. He understood that the Psyker's awakening was only the beginning, that the world he knew and countless others hung by threads spun by a mind both brilliant and unhinged. The lieutenant inhaled deeply, feeling both terror and resolve, knowing that the coming days would test not only his courage, but the very definition of humanity itself. With a final glance at the fractured city below, Kalen took his first steps toward the spire's apex. Somewhere above, beyond perception, the rogue Psyker watched. Somewhere beyond comprehension, the first pulse of chaos spread outward, threading its way toward other worlds. And Kalen understood with a clarity sharpened by fear that the Imperium had not yet faced its true test. The first ripple of Viridian Prime's psychic storm had barely begun to fade when the tremors of influence reached other worlds. The Astra Militarum, stretched thin across multiple sectors, received only fragmented, desperate communications. On Sylvain III, a manufacturing city seethed with panic. Alarms screamed over the Vox network, but the messages carried no coherent meaning. Units reported phantasmal assaults, machinery acting of its own volition, entire squads vanishing mid-march. Civilians spilled into the streets, some clutching family, others fleeing blindly, their cries mingling with the erratic sirens and the low moan of failing warp stabilizers. In the distance, towers of molten metal collapsed, showering the streets with fire and ash, the sky reflecting the chaos like a dying star. Captain Ilara of the 7th Solvane Regiment moved among the citizens, her armor scorched and dented, eyes narrowed beneath her helmet. She tried to restore order, issuing commands through a wavering vox feed, but her voice carried little authority against the psychic dissonance that seemed to ripple through every mind it touched. Even her most disciplined squads faltered, soldiers trembling as fleeting visions of impossible landscapes and screaming entities appeared at the edge of perception. Ilara clenched her fists and pressed on, her determination a fragile counterweight against the invisible storm. Every decision became a moral crucible. Should she prioritize saving civilians, protecting key manufactorums, or securing her remaining forces? Every choice risked 1,000 lives. Every hesitation could spell disaster. Meanwhile, on the world of Dronus 9, rumors of a Psyker-induced catastrophe reached the planetary governor through intercepted messages and fragmented vox channels. Officials argued feverishly over strategy, their discussions a cacophony of panic and bureaucracy. Containment, one declared, or the planet is lost. Another argued for evacuation, but ships capable of carrying millions were already overwhelmed by demand. Outside, the streets writhed with the consequences of an unseen mind. Marketplaces twisted into grotesque patterns, bridges warped into impossible angles, and citizens wandered as if caught in some waking nightmare. It was not merely destruction, it was the sensation of reality bending, of laws once immutable now dissolving beneath the weight of psychic power. In the void between these embattled planets, the Imperium's communication network strained under the strain of distorted signals, voices and messages interwoven with echoes of the warp, fragments of prayers, military codes, and cries for help collided in incomprehensible loops, leaving commanders and clerics alike questioning their own perception. On the bridge of the battlecruiser Vigilant Spirit, Commissar Thane gritted his teeth as he listened to Vox reports that seemed to come from impossible distances, distorted yet clear in meaning. He felt the tug at the edge of his mind, a subtle pressure that whispered of choices and consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. The rogue Psyker was not content to act locally. The storm was expanding, threading its way across sectors like a slow, deliberate plague. Amid the chaos, human resilience and desperation became both tragedy and defiance. Families barricaded themselves in manufactorum basements, children clinging to servitors whose programming flickered unpredictably. Soldiers formed ragged lines, their morale fraying but their instinct for survival unbroken, even as the very air around them seemed alive with psychic interference. On every planet touched by the storm, there was the same sense of moral collapse. Orders conflicted, loyalty strained, and the thin veneer of civilization peeled back to reveal raw, instinctive struggle. The Psyker's influence was both physical and psychological, a pervasive force that tested not only flesh and armor but belief, reason and hope. And yet amid the fires and screams, small acts of courage persisted. A single Skitari unit shielded a group of children from collapsing debris. A sergeant of the Astra Militarum carried a wounded comrade through streets wreathed in flame, and priests chanted liturgies that seemed to resonate faintly, briefly countering the psychic dissonance. These acts, though fleeting and fragile, formed threads of resistance woven against the broader tapestry of destruction. Kalen's experiences on Viridian Prime echoed here. Across worlds, one mind's chaos could topple cities, Yet the choices of mortals, no matter how small, left an indelible mark upon history, and in the distance, the rogue Psyker's presence threaded through the warp, intangible yet undeniable. Worlds that had known stability now existed in a suspended nightmare, a cruel interplay of reality and perception. The fires would burn, the screams would echo, and the moral dilemmas faced by those struggling to survive would linger long after the initial waves of destruction had passed. Across space, across planetary systems, the consequences of one mind's rebellion against the Emperor began to crystallize, a warning of what might come if order failed to contain the storm.